good morning and welcome to January 22nd. Originally, this was January 21st. January 22nd, 2021. This is NEW302. If you came to discussion last night or if you watched the Cyclops lecture, you will be aware that I recorded this yesterday, but I failed to reinitialize my sound mixer, so I wasn't getting any feed from my Yeti mic here. Consequently, I'm recording this again now, and thank you to students for a couple of helpful software suggestions in terms of recording software on file size compressions and so on and so forth. It is perhaps, however, somewhat fitting that I'm up early recording this again because the topic in question for yesterday was a kind of follow-up to the question of motivation. So when I got up quite yesterday. I got up yesterday quite early. I got up at 6, which is about when I got up today, and with the intention, obviously, of recording lectures, and half of which I had already in my mind, which is to say that I already knew I was doing the piece on the book 9 of the Odyssey, the Cyclops chapter. The other half was a bit more elusive, and there was a few things that I did want to discuss, some of which I'll bring up towards the end of this recording. But the core thing that preoccupied me at the time actually was I was feeling quite undermotivated. So, despite the fact of having gotten up very early, I was having a hard time sort of engaging, right, getting moving. And I wouldn't describe that as, depression in the mood sense per se, right? So I didn't feel sad exactly, but I didn't feel very strongly motivated. As is often the case, I tried to take this opportunity to reflect on the state that I was in specifically, right? So it's like, I'm unmotivated. What is there that, is there something interesting to say about this that within the context of this course that is not, sort of giving into that. So just, as a note, very often, if there is an emotional state that's impeding my general approach is to attempt to approach it with curiosity, which, is a mixed bag. It doesn't always work, but I find that very often works. And likewise, I try to take such states and sort of turn them over to use them in my work in various ways, right? Like if I'm going through something, I take it as a given that other people are experiencing something very similar. And so, some analysis of that is often useful. Now, some of the factors involved in having a drop in motivation are not hard to understand, right? As I mentioned last week, we very often have an implicit association with a turnover in the calendar year that we're going to have newness, and instead, people have found that for a variety of reasons, January has been quite stressful. This has really been evident in talking to students, but also, through my client base. There's a lot of stress. And a lot of sort of renewed, open-ended anxiety, right? A great deal of uncertainty. And that is something of a factor, obviously, both for me. I am not sort of unaffected by general social stresses. But also, of course, sometimes this is amplified, as I've mentioned, right? Being a psychotherapist is the kind of work where even if you do have, and you kind of must develop, a degree of even hovering where you can help other people, process what's going on with them, and still manage to set a boundary where you can transition and sort of shift gears into your own life. Even if you do that, the requirement of empathy almost necessarily means that some of that emotional trace will stay with you if indeed it's the case that, there's a particularly hard stretch for your clients. So, definitely the fact that there is a substantial chunk of my practice who are going through, really intense stresses. And that definitely has an effect. On top of that, of course, it's, post-holiday. That's always a bit of a crash. for everybody, generally speaking. Now, of course, it is not the case that for everybody their holidays were especially recuperative, but the assumption that holidays are going to be recuperative, if anything, sort of deepens that crash, right? It is a sort of a double disappointment. However, even if your holidays were pretty decent, there's that kind of post-holiday crash. In addition to that, I'm to a certain extent looking at my biannual recognition that my enthusiasm for project commitment has created a somewhat crowded stretch in my schedule. So that's always an issue. What else on top of that? So, you know, for some people who explicitly have seasonal affective disorder, this time of year is often kind of difficult. I do, and in the past that's been a very serious problem. I have considerably better tools at this point in my life for dealing with that, and so, you know, I've done my level best to try to sort of pour those things on too. But, you know, the realistic fact is that, like, if humans had evolved in this latitude and tuned to this amount of sunlight, you know, we would have fur, right? Or hibernate for the winter. You know, the simple fact that we are not getting enough light, that the cold outside necessitates the wearing of heavier clothing, and so we're exposing even less skin, that there is a renewed stay-at-home order, and so we're inside even more, and we were inside quite a bit, you know, regardless. So I've used a fairly standard arsenal of things, right? I've done a certain amount of dietary adjustment. I've increased my exercise. I've attempted to modulate my schedule to have sort of a more regular length of appropriate sleep, and also increased napping, very important. My, you know, sort of dietary profile is matched with sort of supplement and vitamin profile that's appropriate to the circumstances. I've even rolled the TDCS back into the mix, which is sort of a godsend technology. So yeah, there are all these factors, and I think those factors are probably to a significant extent the dividing line between being amotivated to some extent and being, you know, depressed in the mood sense. Now, depression and amotivation run closely together, and I've pointed out, and I am not alone in this, that very often actually the signature advanced wave, as it were, you know, of incoming sort of mood disorder in that sense, for me typically is boredom. And I see this with my clients a lot too, right? Which is when people become sort of bored in a broad spectrum way, right? Disinterested in a broad spectrum way, that often heralds a certain amount of incoming depression. I take it as something of an advanced symptom. So, you know, it used to be the case back in the day that, you know, anytime I was getting sick, physically sick, like with a cold or flu, I would get a certain kind of advanced symptom. This is when I was traveling most of the time, I was mobile most of the time, but I would get this particular swimminess in my vision about a day before I would start getting sick. It's interesting because I don't tend to get it now, for whatever it's worth, but it was kind of an advanced warning system. If I got this particular kind of swimminess in my vision, it was like my immune system was like, hey, da, 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 and I often knew that meant that I needed to sort of go to ground, right? Like, you know, head back to someplace that meant that I was going to be able to, like, tuck in with blankets and ride things out. I think of or, you know, so sort of supercharge my system with, you know, cold FX or vitamin C or echinacea or, you know, all the various things that you can do to kind of advance treat a cold or flu. Similarly, I tend to think of boredom as being this kind of advanced wave symptom. And boredom, of course, in part is, you know, manifested phenomenologically in terms of sort of a disinterest, right? Things seem insufficiently interesting, insufficiently rewarding. Things often seem, of course, very flat, right? There doesn't seem like there's a lot of point to them. So you know, you go to examine something and it's like, right? But, you know, the sort of natural other half of that very often is that the objects of our boredom, when we consider them, right, also, they don't elicit intrinsic motivation, right? They don't elicit very much interest, right? So you consider the things that you would normally consider, you know, to be fairly engaging, and you're like, nah, meh, right? And if that starts to go broad spectrum, that's usually an early warning sign. So, you know, looking at the question of motivation, generally speaking, we have talked previously about, you know, sort of the relationships between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. And it is generally the case, right, that people, I think people have, although they do not always act on and society does not always support, people have a sense that intrinsic motivation trumps extrinsic motivation. And not everybody has this. A lot of people, you know, pour an enormous amount of effort, and they've been shaped by family culture and culture at large into the pursuit of extrinsically motivated goals. And that's a problem. If you're just motivated by extrinsically motivated goals, very often it's the case that those things, after a while, cease to have the kind of power that they had to sort of get you moving. Intrinsically motivated goals are typically stronger, but they're also more fulfilling. So if you were doing something for its own sake, right, that's often better. This is why you get, like, you know, the oldest convocation speech in the world, right? The oldest and most cliche, so cliched, it's a cliche to say it's a cliche. A phrase that I would itself like to make a cliche. So the oldest, you know, convocation speech in the world is like, do something you love, do something you love. It's either do something you love and the money will follow, or it's, you know, find a job you love and you'll never work a day in your life, or something of this form. And obviously there's something to that. You know, and, you know, when we're talking about that sort of thing, you know, it's useful to bear in mind that there is something to that, but also the possibility of entering certain kinds of intrinsic motivation forms into a sort of an extrinsic mold in various ways can often sort of screw up the sense of intrinsic reward. So we talked about, you know, last semester we talked about, you know, a classic kind of experiment at Stanford in '73, I think, where, you know, they took young children who were engaged in tasks that they enjoyed intrinsically, drawing, right? And kids love to draw. Drawing, for whatever reason, and a developmental psychologist, I imagine, could speak to this at greater depth than I could, but kids love to draw. Drawing is one of these activities that you can sit down and will sort of quiet, still, and focus kids for long periods of time. So if you need a break from a somewhat more frenetic form of play or something when you're looking after kids, or, you know, if you need half an hour to, like, get lunch or dinner ready, you know, having kids draw, giving them the ability, you know, a bunch of paper and a bunch of implements to draw with is often, you know, it's often powerfully compelling for children. So this experiment was interesting because it took a bunch of kids, you know, young children who were drawing, and the only sort of difference that it introduced is that it gave them a reward for their drawings. Okay. Now it's interesting. When I conventionally remember this, my brain switches it, and it you know, does a form of compression that reduces things into a slightly simpler narrative. So my brain always remembers it as they pay the kids $1, right? They pay them $1 a drawing. That's not, in fact, the case. The original experiment, when I took a look, is rather that they rewarded them with like medals, ribbons, yeah, so, like, you know, small token rewards, things that don't even have monetary value for what it's worth, right? But you could imagine it with them being paid for $1. The point is that they were doing it intrinsically, they're drawing the drawing. Then you start giving them, you know, rewards. Oh, here's a ribbon, here's a medal, here's a whatever. And initially speaking, what you see there is a tremendous spike in output, right? Kids will suddenly start doing more output to get more reward. Often, as you can imagine, you see something of a drop in quality, right? Things become somewhat more rushed, right? And less focused because it's just like, okay, let's have volume throughput. But what's interesting is then once that external reward is removed, the rate of drawing drops off, right? It's been rekeyed, in a sense, to an extrinsic reward. And in so doing, the intrinsic reward has sort of removed the nature of the drawing, formerly a play activity which had a strong intrinsic reward, instead, right, is shifted over, and it no longer has that kind of power. So this is a really interesting fact, and one that has enormous sort of consequences if you think about it in the working world generally, both from your perspective in terms of, locating a career, but also from the perspective of employers. It is most often the case that the primary method that an employer has to sort of reinforce their employees is some kind of extrinsic reward, a monetary bonus, say. But what this would seem to indicate is that trying to do that in a creative field is quite likely to actually run cross purposes. You want people to be doing creative work with an intrinsic motivation for the most part, right? Now, and likewise, if you choose a job you love and the money will follow, that's fine. But if the money follows, you may find that you don't love it in quite the same way. Now, that can be rehabbed. I, in my own career, had a number of experiences where I did things that I liked enormously. But when I shifted over to doing them for money, they became a very different animal, right? So I worked as a writer for years, and I've written for pleasure for a long time, since I was young. And I write for pleasure now, at least in part. And the middle period where, the bunch of years where I was working as a writer, that placed an enormous amount of pressure on the work. So, towards the end of my, full-time career, I recall doing things like running analysis on sort of potboiler bestsellers, right? So I would run like a detailed critical analysis on the Da Vinci Code or something because I was like, I need a bestseller. How do I make a bestseller? What is it that people are responding to here, right? And that, of course, always introduces the same problem, which is you're suddenly attempting to get sort of your art, your creative output to follow two masters. On one hand, you are attempting to form it to public whims and tastes and fashions. And on the other hand, you're attempting to sort of follow your own creative muse in some sense, right? I was trying to split the difference, bowl down the middle between my motivations, and it was not very effective. It meant that I didn't like the work that I was producing, for one thing, and that to whatever extent I was getting extrinsic rewards, right, very often it was the case that then I didn't want to engage in that task. A sort of similar version of this, right, but I add, once I stopped doing that, right, there was a process by which I gradually came back into contact with writing as a source of pleasure, and creative output as a source of pleasure. And it's noteworthy that the other half of my kind of narrative creative output was role-playing games. And by times, those things have seemed like something of a chore, and I certainly do a certain amount of those for money these days. But by and large, that remained something of a refuge of creative production. Lots of people also experience this, I add, when they finish their undergrad. There's usually a period of time when people finish an undergrad, in the arts especially speaking, where the process of reading needs to be rehabilitated. So people very often find that they read for pleasure prior to doing a long stretch of undergrad, especially where they're, on the hook to read a lot of books and things. And then it's very hard once they sort of finish their schooling to read for pleasure. It takes time. They need to rediscover it, right? They have to come back in contact and rediscover the pleasures of it in an intrinsic way, because it has been sort of extrinsically loaded, and often there's a sharp distaste for it. It's like, oh, right? That's very common, talking to people who need to sort of rehabilitate their taste for reading. And usually it is rewarding to do so, but it does take time. And you hear the same sorts of things over and over again about like, oh, and then finally I read a book and I was like, oh yeah, I like this, right? I like this. It's not just that I was sort of dancing to a tune to achieve a grade or a mark or a degree or a career. It's like this is a process and an activity that I enjoy, and I enjoy taking in information. Now, the same thing, of course, goes for the process of education in general, which is to say that many people will find that they will begin to have a reactive distaste to learning. And I would contend, of course, that learning is pleasurable. Learning is pleasurable. Learning things is pleasurable, but we develop a distaste for it very often because of this extrinsic system that we're caught in. Not least because it tends to leave a bad taste in our mouth because of the anxieties produced, right? It's one thing if every drawing gets a medal, but what if only you know, I don't know, 20% of the drawings get medals. Like, what does that suddenly do, right? And all the more so, obviously, if you think that you have to acquire these medals to pay rent. So, you know, this is sort of the interaction effect of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. When I talk to people very often about the question of sort of motivation, right? After people tend to resolve, or if they feel like they're sort of on track with larger interpersonal and emotional issues, so if they're grappling with those tend to foreground. The next question very often is motivation. How can I stay motivated? How can I get motivated? How can I, you know, be more consistent in my motivation, et cetera, et cetera. And the formulation that people will most often settle on when they are first considering this is willpower. That's kind of their go-to. And, you know, we have a lot of myths around this, and there do seem to be a small subset of people in the population who are capable of applying a very top-down form of motivational control on themselves. They do things because they need to be done. And so if you ask them, you know, well, how did you get through this? Their answer will be, you know, you just have to do it. This, of course, is never a satisfying answer, because it sort of seems like a satisfying answer. It posits this kind of like, right, I just have to exert myself. But willpower is fickle, right? It's fickle. And in fact, I find that it is very often the case that when I'm dealing with clients, you know, past a certain age, they'll find that that strategy has begun to fail them in various ways, right? That they used to sort of brute force it. And then that stops working. Most of those kinds of top-down systems, you know, eventually speaking, do not function as well. So, you know, if you're just brute forcing yourself through things that you know, have a lot of intrinsic distaste for, eventually that will start to fall off. If you're primarily motivated by fear, that likewise, it'll stop being useful at some point. And you know, what typically happens is you're still experiencing the fear, you're just not doing things anymore in regard to it. And so people will intensify the fear, right? This is particularly the case with people who are very prone to procrastination, where they, you know, sort of intensify things and put them in the crunch, and then try to make the, you know, sort of heroic stretches of the application of willpower in combination with fear to get through things. And when that system starts breaking down, it's a problem. Right? It's a significant problem. So willpower is typically the answer that people give to motivation, but and certainly it's the case, right, that paying attention to intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is a big deal. And if you want to get into intrinsic motivation, right, ultimately speaking, that involves a kind of motivational interviewing style approach to oneself, or in concert, you know, with your therapist or your counselor or friends or what have you, right? Either assisted or by oneself, where you start trying to drill into your values, basically by asking a series of recursive why questions, hopefully not with the sort of like annoying tenacity of a 2-year-old, but, you know, it's like, well, I like this. Why do I like this? Okay, well, I like it because why, but why, but why? And if you can get back in that way, right, through that sort of loop, that recursive loop of the whys, right, which break up the substance, they force you to constantly reformulate until you get back to a more fundamental substance of value. If you can tap into that kind of thing, right, then often it becomes easier to align yourself with a set of tasks that do trigger on your motivations. However, there's another half to this formula, and I think it often gets short shrift in depth psychology, and certainly in Jungian psychology. So when we've looked at depth psychology, Jungian psychology, analytical psychology, right, when we've looked at this stuff, and sort of this is a common feature of parts work generally, we tend to place a very strong emphasis on the role of increased consciousness and the deconstruction of automaticity, right? The role of increased consciousness and the deconstruction of automaticity. So, you know, think about this relative to your complexes. The idea is, right, the more disconnected from regular consciousness something is, the more it is outside your agency, the more attention you want to pay to it, the more you want to attempt to open up a channel of communication with it, because ultimately speaking, that is going to allow you to see its patterns more clearly. It's going to allow you to notice when it's acting inside, right, your sort of mental field, but outside your ego and your conscious control. And eventually it's going to give you the kind of relationship that you need to either A, communicate with it and get it to adjust its behaviors, right? Compel it to adjust its behaviors, or, right, exert a certain kind of control over it so that you can put it in its place. So that is this like, consciousness increasing aspect, right? You want to bring the unconscious into consciousness because that then gives you a more sort of integrated relationship with all these parts. They're not running around doing their thing. Simultaneously, that often entails this deconstruction of automaticity. So the idea is that you don't want your complexes running on their own. You don't want them, by and large, having, a kind of influence over your consciousness that is not derived from your consciousness. And there are problems with this, which I'll get to in a bit. But that is generally the approach, right? It's a kind of, consciousness increasing and automaticity deconstructing approach. But there is, of course, an entire second half to this, and it more often than not gets short shrift. As I said, it doesn't get the same degree of attention. And of course, that's habit. When people most often ask how can I increase motivation, how can I get things done, the answer isn't tremendous acts of willpower. That tends to be largely a failing strategy, right? Or at the very least an inconsistent one, and one that takes an enormous amount of energy. Instead, of course, the task is that you want to create a glide path kind of situation, right? And what that means in essence is the opposite of what you're normally doing when you're talking in depth psych. You actually want to sort of guide and create automatic systems. That's what habits are. So take as an example the sort of, the customary example, right, of people trying to go to the gym, right? So obviously nobody's going to the gym right now, unless you have a gym in your home or your building is, especially low population or something. So nobody's going to the gym right now, but lots of people have had the experience of trying to go to the gym. And how does this work, right? Well, at first, the answer is you say, I really need to go to the gym. Probably you've had a burst of sort of high motivation or, a strong burst of willpower. You're like, I got to go to the gym, get a gym membership, whatever, right? And so when you initially start going to the gym, maybe you hit with tremendous enthusiasm at first, but sooner or later in that initial process, you start to hit resistance. It's too cold out, I'm sore, I've got too much to do, it's time consuming, all of this variety of things, right? Now, not everybody experiences this, I'm sure. There are a small number of people who, sort of love it right off the bat. But for most people, they're going to hit loads of resistance. Like, I'll do it this afternoon, or it's too cold, or it's too whatever, I'll do it tomorrow. And all this resistance. And of course, what has to happen there is, in fact, a tremendous flux. It's an act of willpower. You have to overcome that in order to go in. But the real key to making that work is, of course, habit formation. And so the way habit formation works, in that particular context with the gym, it's like, okay, so what you need to do is you need to go very regularly, ideally every day, right? And you want to make that as consistent in its patterning as possible, right? So if you go every day, you should go every day at, say, 6 a.m., right? I mean, that's early. Let's say 7 a.m., right? So you're like getting up, you're going early, you go before work, say, or before classes or something. So you get up and you go early every day. You attempt to construct things as a ritual, which is to say you create less a sort of, you can do things with symbolic bundling in this case, right? Like a ritual in that more symbolic sense, but rather what you're doing is you're creating a set of repeated events and associations and actions, which you do in the same order each time, right? So you ritualize stuff. So it's like, okay, so every morning you get up, you go, you head out the door at 6:45. So you're programming in time to be there for like an hour, and you grab your gym clothes right in your gym bag, you grab the extra shoes that you need, you switch over to your workout motivational playlist, right? You do this set of things, and maybe you grab yourself whatever your drink of choice is, or your particular water bottle that you use at the gym, and etc., right? There is a kind of ritual garb. You have workout clothes most of the time. You have particular shoes, you have particular drink, you have a particular bag, right? And things are typically done in this like repeated fashion. You do the same thing. Okay, so that repetition is important, and the repetition of timing, that you're doing it at the same time in the same kind of context, right? Something as simple as the general quality of light outside can be a particular kind of thing, where what you're leveraging, of course, is the associations, right? Implicit learning and associations to anchor something into a particular formulation, a particular moment in time, and a particular pattern of events. Okay, so you work out for an hour, and a lot of the time you're gonna have to force yourself to do that, and then you leave. And you keep that pattern up in the same pattern with frequency for, and this is the general rule, 3 weeks. It takes about 3 weeks to get it anchored. Some individual variation. This is going to depend in part by whether or not there were any disruptions, how much initial resistance there was, your personal whatever. Like, there are going to be some variations, but 3 weeks is a rough and ready rule for habit formation, is pretty reasonable. And what happens is, of course, that at the end of the 3 weeks, if you've had this experience, you begin to experience a shift. And the shift is like this, right? You cease to have a set of resistances, right off the bat. And instead, what you get is, when it looks like you are not going to go through with the pattern, you feel restless. Like, there's an antsiness to it, right? There's an antsiness that kicks in. It feels weird to not do it, basically speaking, right? So you've trained a certain kind of expectancy into the system, and now it's like, this is what's supposed to happen. Why isn't it happening, right? And after that point is often when you start getting these kinds of secondary things. For one thing, typically the enjoyment factor, particularly with working out, starts to really kick in. So you move from being in a state of physical discomfort to, right, your body sort of rewarding you with the up boost in various ways. So instead of just feeling sore, you feel good sore, and you start getting sort of endorphin releases, right, second wins, and all these reinforcement mechanisms, and your energy goes up, and you start feeling like you're looking better, and this sort of feedback stuff kicks in too. But a lot of it is just about that habitual formulation, right? Now, you can anchor this in various ways. We've talked about trying to mix together sort of intrinsic reward and extrinsic reward. So, you're going off to the gym and you have problems because you just want to watch Netflix. And so, an answer to that is, download a whole season of the Netflix show that you're hooked on onto an iPad and take it with you to the gym, and make it the case that you can only watch it at the gym. You want to binge the show, you got to do it on the, elliptical or something, right? Which is a strategy that actually can work quite well, right? Pairing something that is an intrinsic form of pleasure, right? And that doesn't tend to get as swamped. It happens to kind of carry over, right? It masks the resistance long enough for you to kick over into the second stage. But what we're really interested in is this post 3 week period where the resistance erodes and you have habit formation. And that's the phase where, among other things, you'll start doing things like, well, I'm here for an hour, but I don't actually have to be anywhere right afterwards. Maybe I'll do an hour and a half. Maybe I'll do 2 hours. It starts to kick in, and, well, I went this morning, but you know what? I'd really like to go back, right? And you start to get sort of that spread where it's like you go in the evening again, right? It becomes a self-rolling wheel, essentially speaking. Like, you've set things up in this way so that it is a self-perpetuating and self-organizing system. It becomes a self-rolling wheel. So this kind of habit formation stuff isn't very often discussed in and around the literature. Typically, it's discussed, right, in the way where there is some negative habitual issue that needs to be subjected to consciousness and needs to be subjected to attention to break down and deconstruct its automaticity so that it stops affecting you. But really, if you consider it, you often want to use a kind of hybrid strategy. You also want to be aided. That's a case where you're giving a bunch of implicit rules and motivational things into your unconscious, and yes, they're definitely being a bit pushy with you, right? When you are like, well, I'm not going to the gym today, and you feel antsy, right? You feel anxious, you feel nervous. It's weird to not go, but it is also the case that, right, you've constructed this thing to aid you in a task. The automaticity of that system, is useful. You're using it in tandem with other forms of thing. And habit formation, right, and that kind of construction of a glide path, really is an essential component, frankly, to engaging in most kinds of change. Just attempting to rely on willpower and motivation in their natural sense is, not typically that useful of a strategy, not for most people. You need to combine it together with this habitual formation, and that tends to run counter to the kinds of assumptions that we often have in DevPsych. Now, it's interesting because you can think of lots of cases, sort of therapeutically, where really you're using a combination of sort of a conscious and an unconscious strategy in this way. So, take, for instance, anxiety, right? An extremely common issue, comes up, in session with people all the time, especially in our modern era where there are a lot of things that people are anxious about. So, when you're dealing frontline with a case of anxiety, right, you might, once you are engaged in the task, begin to engage a more classic kind of parts work, psychodynamically oriented approach to anxiety. So we've talked, for instance, about the anxiety box. And the anxiety box is a technique where, people are feeling overwhelmed with anxieties. You instruct them to get themselves a special box of some kind, slips of paper, write the anxieties down, put them in the box, and then say, ideally out loud, if they can get over that anxiety, ideally out loud, I don't have time for this right now, but we're going to address this on Thursday at 7 p.m. And, right, the effect that this has, provided that one actually does so, provided that one actually does address it at that time, you go back, open up the box and go through these anxieties, like read them one by one and really consider them and take them seriously. As I've discussed, it's a lot like when a kid is trying to get your attention. A kid is attempting to get your attention. They're like, mom, 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 or whatever, right? And you're like, honey, I don't have time for this right now. We can talk about it after dinner. Now, kids will develop a degree of self-regulation around this, provided that you follow through. You have to follow through on your promise, right? If you don't follow through on your promise, what you do is you erode trust. Right? And then the kid is less likely to engage in that process. Why should they? They don't believe the outcome that you're proposing. You've eroded trust. I add, incidentally, this goes both ways. The same thing is true for the very common scenario of parents who threaten consequences of various kinds and then don't follow through on those. This likewise, people may think that what they're doing by giving into, like a kid's pressures and is going to, please the kid, like, oh yeah, we've been, good about this. And obviously, right, there are lots of punishments that, I wouldn't necessarily agree with, but the point is, right, if you threaten a particular consequence with a kid and you don't follow through on it, yes, they may immediately experience relief, but what you also do is erode trust, right? Your word doesn't mean anything anymore. And that really matters, right? It affects a whole cycle of things, as we've discussed. So, okay, so you have to follow through, and lots of people will choose to take their anxiety box and follow through, say, in session, right? I'll bring it with me to therapy. So provided that you do that, of course, what you're doing is training a certain kind of deferral, right? A certain kind of self-regulation, right? So there is a self-soothing, there is a tolerance of one's own distress, right? Because it's deferred to a future moment. And then, of course, by the time you get to the future moment, because feelings are, typically, frankly, relatively short-lived, by the time you get to the box, it just doesn't have the same kind of intensity under schedule. And you look at these things one by one, and of course one has this sharp experience of like, what was I so flipped out about? And that then distances one from the panicky reality, right? From the swamping immediate reality. That's a very parts work kind of approach. And that's definitely something you would do in anxiety. But consider what the frontline anxiety technique is for virtually everybody, okay? The frontline anxiety technique is breathing. And we talked about this last semester too, right? Breathing is funny because it exists on this borderline between conscious and unconscious, right? We can control our breathing because speech, right? So consciously we can control our patterns of breathing. You can hold your breath, but also most of the time your breath is operating automatically. And there are not that many systems that are like that in your body. One that you can exert a voluntary control over, but also, right, is in this unconscious space. He said, taking a deep breath. So the very first thing that we do often in anxiety is we try to do controlled breathing, right? You try to get deep breathing. And what's the idea here? The idea is that you have a feedback loop operating between sort of different levels within your system. So you're having a mental, a cognitive response that in turn activates your body resources, right? You start going into anxiety, start like running the engine high in fight or flight. But of course, it turns out that this is not something that you can exactly flee or fight. And so the system is just grinding away, right? With cortisol and adrenaline and right, various other kinds of pretty stressful hormones. You just remain in a state of high activation without any way to output it. And so because the mental threat, right, translates into that physical activation, you show a variety of physical symptoms, right? You're breathing shallowly, you feel tense, etc. But you can also, of course, the body in that case is sort of taking the cue from cognition. Now, cognition is freaked out. I guess I should go into activation. But it can also go the other way. And so one of the purposes of deep breathing is that by slowing your breathing down, the parts of your mind which are monitoring what's going on in your body are like, well, whatever it is that's attacking us can't be that bad because we're breathing so deeply and slowly, right? And there is an inconsistency there, but eventually what will happen is that the mind will begin to calm down. Of course, it also helps that you're getting, increased oxygen flow and so on and so forth. But, the mind will start to calm because it's like, well, the body seems fine. Like the body seems fine. So I guess it's less of an issue, right? There is that feedback. Now, if you think about that, fundamentally speaking, in most ways, that is not a consciousness-driven effect. It's an unconscious effect. It is an unconscious manipulation. Yes, you use consciousness to impose a particular kind of state, right, on your body. But thereafter, the way that it affects is not that consciousness is just, right, is just telling itself, calm down. That's not what's happening. What's happening is that you're passing it off to a set of more unconscious, more automatic systems. And those systems are affecting the actual task that you want them to affect, right? Your only component in this is sort of slowing down this lower system, and then the internal loop between those systems is taking over. So, now that kind of breathing exercise often combined with mindfulness, and mindfulness is more of a conscious, right, bringing things into consciousness, even hovering kind of approach. But the point that I'm getting at is that very often actual interventions involve this in concert of techniques which are sort of putting light on and de-automatizing unconscious factors, and things which in essence are sort of structuring and giving information to unconscious processes, right? And trying to get those unconscious processes self-propelling. If you are doing these breathing exercises, right, or if you're taking up meditation, what's the next thing? You try to make it a habit, right? So you try to get people not to simply engage in breathing exercises when they're freaked out. You try to get them to do it regularly. And doing that, of course, is setting up, right, habitual material. So I wanted to speak a little bit about that because that kind of habit formation thing, is something that comes up so often. People talk about with homework and it's like, well, go every day, do an hour every day, change your workplace so that you have a different structure. So if you're normally doing like Facebook and online video gaming at this computer, like go work at the kitchen table kind of thing, like change your setting, make it a ritual. And if you can basically keep that crunch up, if you know that you're only doing something for 3 weeks, rather than in this open-ended, sort of uncertain way, doing something for 3 weeks is pretty doable. And that is the degree of focus you need. You're forcing yourself for 3 weeks according to a very tight schedule. But if you can do it for 3 weeks, then you get the self-rolling system, right? That's where the habit starts to kick in. Not that it never requires any willpower to maintain after that, but there is a kind of glide path. There's a path of least resistance that's formed, right, by having that kind of formulation. So, yeah, so that's a little bit of what I wanted to talk about today. In fact, I already spoke about it, but I did the whole thing in mime, so I wanted to do it again. One other quick note that I'm going to make. I mentioned this to a few people in discussion last night, but as you know, I recently purchased the Black Books, which are sort of Jung's original work notebooks, which are so far quite fascinating. I've not had a chance to dig in super deeply, but what I've already seen is really interesting. And I went to a kind of online seminar by Sanu Shamdasani, who was the project lead and one of the translators that put this together. It was quite interesting. I mean, it was a little introductory. He was talking about translation challenges, and he himself and his collaborators are sort of interested in what people are getting out of the book. But as a consequence, he was talking also about a number of Jung's unpublished manuscripts. And I didn't realize actually how much unpublished material they have of his. You know, he was extremely prolific, but I didn't realize how much unpublished material they have. And one of the things that he mentioned was an unpublished manuscript, which they are currently attempting to transcribe, translate, and have published. They're doing crowdfunding. This is incidentally through the Philemon Foundation, So Philemon, like Jung's Philemon, right? Foundation. So if you Google them, you can find this thing. So he mentioned in part, and I was talking a little bit after that, mentioned that, you know, in addition to his mass of articles of various kinds, Jung also produced a more substantial book, typically about one a decade, except in the 1930s. And the 1930s was a period of time where he was having an enormous expansion in his theory and creative output. So there's always been a bit of a gap there. Well, it turns out that they actually have this manuscript. It's an unpublished manuscript from 1937. And of course, it caught me right away because the title is Alchemy and Individuation. And it is the original text which Jung was writing on alchemy and his theories around alchemy and his first serious formulation of individuation. Now, he drops it partway through because he's like, I'm not up to this task. I don't have it yet. But, right? And later he comes back to that. So we get, you know, alchemical studies, we get Mysterium, we get these later texts where he's doing the alchemical stuff, and we get like the opening of Ion, for instance, where he's talking about the individuation process in detail. But this is a really early take from 1937 where he's formulating these themes. So obviously that caught my attention. And they're doing crowdfunding. For some reason, they're not doing crowdfunding on Kickstarter. So I reached out to them and said, look, I'm a veteran of like 177 Kickstarter campaigns. And, you know, I've participated in some launches, but like I was a super backer more than once. I've funded a lot of Kickstarter campaigns, and so I'm very familiar. And it's like, this would rip, right? You're trying to raise $120,000. This would blast through that very easily, I think, if you put it on a more public radar instead of just having a donation button on the Philemon Foundation. So go check that out if you're interested. Donate. I'm in talks with them right now to try to shift it, possibly to a bigger platform, because I think obviously there's a broader public interest, and $120,000 is peanuts in crowdfunding land. They should be able to get that quite easily as long as they can offer high quality product. And of course they have the black books and the red book to their credit. If they get anything even remotely approaching that, people are gonna go to it. So I thought that was interesting. I wanted to bring it to people's attention. I'll give you updates if it goes anywhere. I have been talking to a few people at the Philemon Foundation about this. I would of course love to get a look at this thing, if at all possible, obviously not in person or no time soon, but I'm quite fascinated. Those are two subjects that are of enormous personal and professional interest to me, but I also suspect might interest quite a few of you. So, okay, so that's today. That's the retalk. I'll say that was, I suspect, considerably smoother than the first take, since my thoughts were largely pre-formulated. But I wanted to give some thought to those two items. I encourage you to give some thought to them too. Next week, I've got solo platform, so I'm going to be doing sort of the bulk of my Odyssey stuff next week when there are no students. And then the week after that, we've got, I keep thinking It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. I don't know why my brain is doing that, but Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, which is a very different thing. It's a Coen Brothers adaptation of the Odyssey, in a sense, with George Clooney and a bunch of people. It's excellent if you've never seen it. So that link will go up. But next week, I'll be hitting the Odyssey hard. Yeah, and in the meanwhile, I hope you guys have a great week.